Book summary: Guns, Germs, and Steel. Author: Jared Diamond. Preface: Yali's question. In 1972, while Jared Diamond was studying biology in Papua New Guinea, he met Yali, a smart and curious local. While walking together on a beach, Yali suddenly asked, "Why do you, white people, have so much cargo, goods, possessions, while we, black people, have so little?" Yali's question was not just about material goods but touched on the deeper essence of human history. Why has development been uneven? Why did some societies early on possess weapons, germs, and steel to conquer the world, while others were colonized or lagged behind for thousands of years? Rejecting explanations based on race or intelligence, Diamond opted for a scientific approach. He analyzed geography, climate, ecosystems, resources, and cultural social factors. Yali's question became the driving force for a cross-disciplinary work, combining biology, geography, archaeology, linguistics, and anthropology. Guns, Germs, and Steel is an effort to answer that question comprehensively. Diamond argues that geography determined where agriculture emerged early, where plants and animals were easily domesticated, leading to organized societies that accumulated food surpluses, developed technology, and gained political military power. This is not a story of genetics but the consequence of humans starting from vastly different geographic positions. Chapter 1, Up to the Starting Line. The story of inequality among peoples begins when humans worldwide lived in small groups, surviving by hunting and gathering. Around 13,000 years ago, no place on Earth was superior in technology, social organization, or political power. But then, in some regions, progress happened rapidly, leading those societies to develop states, writing, weapons, and deadly diseases, while others did not. Jared Diamond begins the first chapter by reframing Yali's question: how can we understand the uneven development of civilizations without falling into racial biases? The answer, according to him, lies not in intelligence or biological traits but in evolutionary history, environment, and access to natural resources. One key point Diamond emphasizes is the timing and location where agriculture first developed. In the Fertile Crescent, the region stretching from southern Turkey to Iran, humans early on learned to cultivate cereals, domesticate animals, and build more stable societies. The emergence of agriculture laid the foundation for the development of food surpluses, a prerequisite for labor specialization, the formation of governments, armies, and technology. Meanwhile, areas like Australia, Southern Africa, or the Amazon rainforest lacked comparable potential crops or livestock. This difference, Diamond argues, was not due to the people there being less intelligent but because they lacked favorable natural conditions. Geography, in the broadest sense, dictated the pace of development of human societies. Diamond also introduces the concept of a causal chain of development, from the ability to domesticate plants and animals, leading to food surpluses, then to larger populations, the emergence of classes, and labor division. This ultimately led to the rise of states and weapon technology. What appears to be superior civilization is actually the result of a chain of accumulated conditions over thousands of years. Diamond asserts, to seriously answer Yali's question, we must start from the very beginning of human history, the era when we all stood equal in wild forests and savannas. From that point, geography began to speak. Chapter 2, A Natural Experiment of History. In this chapter, Jared Diamond conducts a unique historical test, a rare, natural experiment left by history. He compares two groups of people with a shared Polynesian ancestry but who followed completely different developmental paths, the Maori in New Zealand and the Moriori in the Chatham Islands, about 800 kilometers to the east. Both groups originated from the same ancestral culture, bringing the same technology, language, and social organization when they left the main island. But the geographic conditions where they settled shaped very different historical paths. The Chatham Islands had a cold climate, nutrient-poor soil, and scarce resources, unsuitable for agriculture. The Moriori were forced to abandon farming, reverting to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, living in small, scattered, and peaceful groups. In contrast, New Zealand had a temperate climate, fertile soil, and abundant food sources, sufficient for large-scale agriculture. The Maori thrived in farming, creating surpluses, leading to a stratified society with chiefs, warriors, construction projects, weapons, and internal conflicts, a society typical of one moving toward state organization. This contrast reached its climax in 1835, when a small group of armed, organized, and warlike Maori landed on the Chatham Islands and swiftly annihilated the peaceful and defenseless Moriori. They massacred, enslaved, and turned the islands into a colony. As Diamond writes, the Moriori lived in peace, while the Maori killed. It was the geographic environment that wrote their two different histories. Diamond uses this case to reinforce a key message: differences in development stem not from genes, race, or initial culture but from the environmental conditions to which people had to adapt. Chapter 3, Collision at Cajamarca. In November 1532, in the Cajamarca Valley in the Andes, a clash between two worlds occurred, altering the history of an entire continent. Francisco Pizarro, with 168 Spanish soldiers, entered the territory of the Inca Empire, a state with tens of thousands of soldiers, a tightly structured government, developed mountain roads, and deep-rooted indigenous beliefs. So what enabled a small group of Europeans to capture the powerful Emperor Atahualpa within hours? Jared Diamond meticulously analyzes the Cajamarca event as a clear demonstration of the Spaniards' technological, organizational, and strategic superiority, all the result of thousands of years of development in the unique geographic social environment of Eurasia. The Spaniards had steel weapons, rapier swords sharp enough to pierce Inca armor. They had muskets, though not highly accurate, which created immense psychological impact, and they had horses, a species never seen in the Americas. The combination of cavalry, rapid attacks, and the sound of gunfire created a shock that left the Incas unable to resist. Additionally, the Spaniards had writing, allowing them to learn from previous conquests, such as Hernán Cortés's in Mexico. They knew how to lure Atahualpa out, set up an ambush, and separate the leader from his army, while the Incas, without writing, relied on oral communication. Diamond emphasizes the psychological factor. The Spaniards were driven by religious zeal, spreading Christianity, and economic motives, seeking gold and silver. In contrast, the Incas were in turmoil after a civil war over succession, their population weakened by smallpox, which had spread from Central America just before the Spaniards arrived. The collision at Cajamarca was not merely a battle but a symbol of the historical disparity accumulated over millennia. Diamond concludes that Pizarro's victory was not the result of personal courage or military genius but of long-term advantages. Designed to help you develop effective writing strategies, this course will guide you on organizing thoughts, crafting clear paragraphs, and writing compelling essays with step-by-step instructions and illustrative examples. Start your journey to becoming a more confident writer today. Chapter 4, Farmer Power. When humans learned to sow seeds and raise livestock, the world entered a new era. About 11,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, the area encompassing the modern Middle East, plants like wheat, barley, and lentils were domesticated. This was where humans first accumulated food surpluses, and from there, everything began to change. These surpluses freed humans from the daily task of foraging for food. Instead, they could become blacksmiths, inventors, priests, or warriors. The massive granaries at Uruk, an ancient city in Mesopotamia, enabled the formation of ruling classes, armies, and rudimentary administrative systems. For Jared Diamond, agriculture did not just provide food, it created power. Agricultural societies had larger populations, were more tightly organized, and had armies and metal tools. They easily overwhelmed or assimilated hunter-gatherer communities. For example, the Natufians in the Levant built settled villages thanks to abundant wild wheat, while the Aboriginal people in Australia, lacking domesticable crops, remained nomadic in the desert for tens of thousands of years. Animal husbandry also brought immense benefits, from milk, meat, and draft power to hides and fertilizer. Sumerian society fully exploited this power to sustain a ruling class, build city-states, and expand influence. In contrast, groups without conditions for agriculture, like the Tasmanians, were severely limited by scarce resources and the absence of large animals to domesticate. Diamond argues that it was the availability of domesticable plants and animals, not intelligence or ambition, that determined a society's ability to develop civilization. The story of the farmer is thus not just about tilling fields but about building empires. From small wheat fields, humanity erected great civilizations, created tools of domination, and laid the foundation for societal inequalities that persisted for millennia. Chapter 5: History's Haves and Have-Nots. Not every place on Earth welcomed the dawn of agriculture at the same time. In the Fertile Crescent, from 8500 BC, people domesticated wheat, barley, and goats, building the first settlements like Jericho, home to the world's oldest known city walls. China also developed agriculture early, with rice in the Yangtze River basin and millet in the north. In Mesoamerica, indigenous people domesticated maize and beans at Tehuacan. This laid the foundation for the Olmec civilization and later the Maya and Aztec. These regions were independent centers of agricultural innovation, where humans not only farmed but also invented irrigation, storage, and new social organizations. They became the cradles of ancient civilizations. However, not every region was so fortunate. Egypt, for instance, though it did not independently develop agriculture, quickly adopted crops like wheat and barley from the Levant, then built an empire along the Nile with pyramids and a complex administrative system. In contrast, areas like Australia and California remained lands of hunter-gatherers. This was not because their people were inferior or lazy but because they lacked domesticable crops and animals. For example, Aboriginal Australians had only acorns, which were hard to cultivate, low in energy, and could not produce surpluses. Native Californians lived by hunting deer and gathering fruits, suitable for their environment but insufficient for a stratified society. In New Guinea, although people domesticated taro and bananas, these crops were low in energy, hard to store, and could not support a non-producing class. Moreover, the island's mountainous terrain, lacking large animals for domestication, prevented the rise of an empire like those elsewhere. Diamond concludes that the natural environment, not human capability, determined whether a society would become a center of innovation or remain in prolonged stagnation. The haves, those with crops, livestock, and favorable climates, unintentionally held the future in their hands. Chapter 6: To Farm or Not to Farm. Transitioning from hunting-gathering to agriculture was a turning point, but not everyone chose this path. Jared Diamond argues that this decision was not merely cultural but a reflection of geographic and environmental conditions. When game became scarce, like gazelles in the Levant, humans had to plant wheat to survive. But agriculture required heavy labor, uncertain harvests, and vulnerability to weather. Many groups stuck to their old ways if the environment allowed. For example, Aboriginal Australians continued hunting kangaroos, gathering wild fruits, and digging roots because the desert offered no support for farming. No native Australian plants were suitable for domestication, their seeds were small, hard to process, toxic, or low in nutrients. Meanwhile, the availability of crops like wheat in the Fertile Crescent and animals like cattle in Sumer created conditions for agriculture to take root. Tools like stone sickles and hand mills were invented to boost harvest efficiency. Diamond adds that in some regions, like the highlands of New Guinea, people farmed taro and bananas early on, but these crops were low in energy, hard to store, and unable to support non-producing classes like artisans or warriors. Moreover, rugged terrain, divided by mountains and rivers, kept populations scattered, making it hard to develop centralized governments or expand territory. Though they had agriculture, it was small-scale and produced little surplus. Population growth created pressure, forcing groups to compete for land. Farmers, being more numerous, often overpowered hunters, like those from the Fertile Crescent. They surpassed neighboring tribes, expanded their territories, and reshaped the human map. But in barren lands, like Australia's deserts or New Guinea's jungles, the old way of life persisted for thousands of years because nature offered no viable alternative. This story is about how nature and competition shaped societal development paths. From the first seeds to civilizations, it reveals that agriculture, though history's greatest driver, was not everyone's choice. Chapter 7: How to Make an Almond. Imagine an ancient farmer in the Fertile Crescent accidentally choosing non-shattering wheat seeds to plant. Over centuries, this small act transformed wild wheat into a modern crop. This is a clear testament to a silent but powerful process of artificial selection. Similarly, lentils, olives, and barley were domesticated at ancient settlements like Jericho and Catalhoyuk from wild plants. They grew scattered in nature. Humans did not intentionally create agriculture but unconsciously exploited beneficial traits, like large seeds, easy harvesting, or sweet fruit. This process relied entirely on intuition and long-term observation, not genetic knowledge. However, not all plants were easy to domesticate. Only a few species, like wheat in the Levant, rice in China, or maize in Mexico, had favorable genetic traits. They were suitable for cultivation. These crops often had short life cycles, grew quickly, and responded clearly to selective breeding. In Australia, Aboriginal people relied on acorns, hard to cultivate, low in nutrients, and toxic if not processed carefully. This prevented them from developing stable agriculture. In contrast, in Mesoamerica, the ancestor of maize was teosinte, a grass with small, hard, and sparse kernels. It took thousands of years of selection and experimentation for maize to become a staple food. The scarcity of suitable crops limited agricultural development in many places. Only regions with a rare combination of favorable climate and biologically rich resources, like the Fertile Crescent, the Yangtze River Basin, and the Central American highlands, could take the first step. The agricultural revolution then spread farming technology to other regions through trade and migration. The story of an almond is not just about a single plant. It is about how biodiversity, geographic luck, and human patience combine to form civilizations, from a single seed to a meal, and then an empire. Chapter 8: Apples or Indians. Why did the native people of California, living in a fertile land, never farm? Jared Diamond argues that the answer lies not in intelligence or cultural choice but in ecological conditions. In the Fertile Crescent, humans were surrounded by wheat and barley, easily domesticated, energy-rich, storable, and suitable for producing surpluses. In contrast, California had only acorns, high in tannins, hard to cultivate, and less nutritious. Thus, the Chumash and other native tribes lived by hunting deer, gathering fruits, and fishing, needing no agriculture to sustain their communities. Similarly, in the eastern United States, though they had sunflowers and some native squashes, most crops lacked the yield or efficiency to support large agricultural societies. People continued hunting and gathering, living in small, mobile groups. In Australia, plants like spinifex or wild seeds were insufficient to feed large populations. The arid environment, nutrient-poor soil, and lack of domesticable crops kept Aboriginal people tied to a nomadic lifestyle, though they were highly skilled at managing and exploiting natural resources. In contrast, in Mesoamerica, wild teosinte, though initially small, hard, and low in nutrients, was selectively bred. Over thousands of years, it became the maize we know today. This process was slow, requiring patience and accumulated knowledge across generations. But thanks to it, the region became one of the world's key agricultural centers. Diamond emphasizes, the limitations were not due to human lack of creativity but because nature provided insufficient raw materials to start with. Where suitable crops existed, people could build villages, cities, and empires. Where they didn't, like in New Guinea, despite having taro, the low yield and nutritional value couldn't support a non-producing class or wealth accumulation. Societies only developed agriculture when natural conditions allowed. Without those conditions, they weren't lagging, they were simply stuck in a hunter-gatherer cycle. Not because they didn't want change, but because they had nothing to start with. Chapter 9: Zebras, Unhappy Marriages. Domesticating animals is a complex puzzle. To turn a wild species into a companion, everything must align: a docile temperament, simple diet, fast growth, and good reproductive capacity. In Eurasia, cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses met these criteria, providing meat, milk, draft power, and transportation. For example, cattle in Sumer pulled plows, boosting agricultural productivity and paving the way for settled societies. These animals also had the advantage of living in herds, accepting hierarchy, and being easily led, key factors for human control. In contrast, in the Americas, only llamas and turkeys were domesticated, with limited roles. Llamas were mainly used in the Andes and didn't spread to other regions due to rugged terrain. Africa had zebras, but they were too aggressive and uncontrollable to be ridden like horses. Australia had only the dingo, a semi-domesticated wild dog, insufficient to support agricultural production. The scarcity of domesticable animals was not random. Species had to meet human needs, easy to raise, omnivorous or grass-eating, fast breeding, and controllable. Eurasia was fortunate to have many ideal candidates, like goats in the Levant or pigs in China. These geographic and biological conditions created an undeniable head start. Diamond likens the relationship between humans and animals to marriages. Only when all factors align does the partnership succeed. Continents like the Americas, Africa, and Australia faced unhappy marriages with nature, lacking four-legged partners. These were needed to build civilizations. As a result, Eurasia thrived, with animals aiding plowing, transporting goods, serving as warhorses, and providing food. In contrast, regions without suitable animals were confined to small-scale production, unable to accumulate surpluses or advance technology or complex societies. History was partly decided by the animals willing to cooperate. Chapter 10: Spacious Skies and Tilted Axes. Imagine a wheat seed leaving the Fertile Crescent, spreading to Greece, India, and China within centuries. Eurasia's east-west axis, with similar climates from Portugal to Japan, allowed wheat, barley, and cattle to adapt easily. Trade along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers accelerated this diffusion, helping technology, language, and agriculture spread. Thanks to this, crops and livestock from Mesopotamia spread to Europe and Asia without needing significant changes in planting seasons or farming conditions. This climatic similarity created ideal conditions for innovations to spread. A tool, crop, or farming technique could be applied with minimal adaptation. This made the wheel, plow, metallurgy, and writing easily transferable from one region to another in far less time than in other continents. For example, the wheel, invented in Mesopotamia, quickly appeared in Turkey and then Europe. In contrast, the Americas and Africa's north-south axes posed climatic barriers. Maize from Mexico took thousands of years to adapt to the Andes due to differences in daylight and seasons. Temperature, humidity, and day length changed rapidly with latitude, forcing crops to readapt from scratch. In Africa, sorghum struggled to cross the Congo rainforest. For example, llamas domesticated in the Andes couldn't survive in Mexico, preventing transport methods from spreading between regions. Additionally, the Americas were divided by mountains, deserts, and jungles, like the Rockies, Sonoran Desert, or Amazon, natural walls separating cultures. An innovation in Central America faced numerous barriers to reach South America. Similarly, Africa was split by the Congo rainforest and Sahara Desert, preventing agricultural and technological innovations from spreading seamlessly from north to south. This slow diffusion hindered development in continents outside Eurasia. While Eurasia accumulated knowledge and resources, from plows to writing, other regions lagged behind. Innovations had to be reinvented or took ages to reach new places. The east-west axis became a highway for civilization, propelling Eurasia to the forefront, not because its people were superior, but because of how the continents were drawn on the map. Chapter 11: Lethal Gift of Livestock. When humans began raising pigs and cattle, they unwittingly opened a Pandora's box: germs. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza originated from livestock, spreading to humans in Eurasia. With dense populations living near stables, Eurasians were constantly exposed to pathogens, gradually developing immunity over thousands of years. For example, smallpox from cattle infected humans in Sumer, but survivors passed immunity genes to their descendants. Devastating pandemics like the Black Death, though catastrophic, also acted as natural selection for immune systems. When Spaniards reached the Americas, these germs became invisible weapons of mass destruction. Smallpox wiped out up to 95% of the native population, from Aztecs to Incas, within a century of Columbus's arrival. Diseases didn't need swords or guns, spreading through soldiers, traders. They also spread through goods. Sometimes, Spaniards unintentionally transmitted diseases via clothing, food, or simple contact. Native peoples had never encountered pigs, cattle, or sheep, so they had no chance to build prior immunity. They were unaware of influenza viruses or measles bacteria and had no way to resist. Populations collapsed, societies fell into chaos, leaders died without successors, and armies disintegrated. Entire civilizations crumbled before they could fight. In contrast, the Americas had only llamas and turkeys, not enough to generate comparable diseases. Without large-scale animal husbandry, natives didn't develop widespread infectious diseases, and thus had no antibodies to defend themselves. When the clash occurred, this biological asymmetry was a decisive factor. The story of germs is not just about disease but about how agriculture and livestock farming gave Eurasia a biological edge. From filthy stables, from close proximity to animals, from deadly epidemics, Eurasians gained an invisible armor. And it was this armor, not the sword, that brought down the Incas and Aztecs. Chapter 12, Blueprints and Borrowed Letters. Writing, like a flame illuminating civilization, emerged in Mesopotamia with cuneiform around 3000 BC, used to record trade, taxes, and laws. These symbols were not just communication tools but the foundation for state management and knowledge accumulation. From the clay tablets of the Sumerians, writing spread to Egypt, where it was used to build pyramids and manage populations with hieroglyphs. In Mesoamerica, the Maya invented their own hieroglyphic system to record astronomical calendars and ceremonial events. However, unlike Sumerian or Egyptian writing, Maya script didn't spread to neighboring regions, partly due to geographic distance and partly because there was no trade network large enough to support its diffusion. The Inca Empire, though powerful, lacked a writing system due to its isolation. They used a system of knotted cords called quipu to record information. The Spaniards, thanks to Cortez's records of the Aztec conquest, planned the Inca conquest with precision. Meanwhile, the Incas had no written history to learn about prior invasions, leaving them caught off guard and disadvantaged. The story of writing here is not just about invention but about its ability to spread. Societies with robust trade and complex administration fostered the creation and growth of writing. In places like New Guinea or inland Australia, where people lived as hunter-gatherers with sparse populations, there was neither the need nor the conditions to develop writing systems. The absence of writing doesn't reflect inferiority but results from unsuitable geographic, social, and economic contexts. This chapter shows that writing is a pivotal invention but not universal. It's not an inevitable product of intelligence but a response to the need to manage complex societies. From Uruk to Tenochtitlan, from the first blueprints to borrowed letters, the development of writing was a turning point in shaping human civilization. Chapter 13, Mother of Necessity. Technology, from steel blades to cannons, is the fire of power. In Eurasia, large populations and vibrant trade along rivers like the Euphrates and Danube created conditions for ideas to spread. Inventions didn't arise solely from genius but, more importantly, from interactions between civilizations, driven by the needs of war, trade, and governance. Knowledge accumulation, over centuries and generations, was the true foundation. China invented gunpowder in the 9th century, initially for fireworks and rituals. But in Europe, where small states fiercely competed, gunpowder was quickly refined into muskets and cannons, weapons that changed the global balance of war. This shows that technology doesn't just depend on invention but on the motivation to use and improve it. Competition among kingdoms like Spain, France, and England drove innovation. Ports, banking systems, and merchant classes formed networks that supported technological growth, from warships crossing the Atlantic to printing presses spreading knowledge. In contrast, the Tasmanians, completely isolated on their island, had no chance to exchange knowledge or adopt improvements. They used stone axes and even forgot how to make some tools due to a lack of interaction and continuous learning. Another example is Japan. In 1543, they learned gunmaking from the Portuguese, but the conservative samurai class rejected change, favoring swords and bows. This shows that technology needs not only to be invented but also accepted and integrated into society. Florence, a bustling, wealthy city, became the cradle of the Renaissance, where ideas bloomed like fireworks, while the Americas, with fewer cities and trade networks, developed more slowly. By 1500, Europeans held guns, while the Incas had only stone spears, not because Europeans were smarter but because they lived on different historical paths. From Toledo's forges to global battlefields, technology, ultimately, is the product of a society that encourages, adopts, and refines it based on real needs. Chapter 14, From Egalitarianism to Kleptocracy. As populations grew due to agriculture, egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups gave way to hierarchical societies. In Europe, in the Fertile Crescent, massive granaries required kings and officials to manage them. Food surpluses allowed a non-producing class, like priests, soldiers, and artisans, to live off others' surplus, and from this, states emerged to organize, protect, and control. Large populations led to complex political systems, from tribes to states. Religion also emerged, reinforcing power, like the Inca's sun god or Babylon's Marduk. Divine symbols legitimized rule, making people more accepting of centralized authority. For example, the Inca Empire used quipu cords to manage populations and collect taxes but lacked writing for long-term record-keeping, limiting their ability to transmit knowledge. As societies expanded, oral laws were no longer sufficient. States needed written records for taxes, conscription, and land boundaries. Legal systems were formalized, from Babylon's Code of Hammurabi to Roman law. Standing armies were established not only to fend off invaders but also to maintain internal order. Violence was now concentrated in the hands of the state, along with tools like prisons. Police and penalties were also instituted. In contrast, Aboriginal Australians, with small groups and no food surpluses, maintained equality. They needed no centralized government or complex laws, as everyone knew each other and could resolve conflicts directly. Such societies, though stable, couldn't scale up or advance technologically due to a lack of surplus for labor division. In Eurasia, centralized states like Rome built armies and bureaucracies, ready for war. They recorded with writing, established laws, and collected taxes to run empires. The Americas, though home to the Aztecs, developed later and lacked horses or steel, tools that bolstered state power and territorial expansion. These differences didn't stem from intelligence but from geographic, ecological, and historical foundations accumulated over time. This story is about how agriculture not only nourished bodies but shaped societies, from small Levant villages to empires with palaces and temples, where power concentrated in the hands of a few, reinforced by religion, weapons, and writing. Chapter 15, Yali's People. In Australia and New Guinea, time seemed to stand still. Aboriginal Australians lived for over 40,000 years by hunting kangaroos and gathering acorns but didn't develop agriculture or centralized states. This wasn't due to inferiority but because the environment was too harsh: barren deserts, scarce water, nutrient-poor soil, and no easily domesticable wild plants or animals. These limitations prevented them from accumulating food surpluses, the prerequisite for forming specialized classes or stratified societies. In New Guinea, though taro and pigs were domesticated, dense mountainous terrain and tangled jungles isolated communities. They lived scattered, with little connection, unable to form stable trade networks for goods and knowledge. Moreover, taro, though easy to grow, didn't store well, had low nutritional value, and lacked the energy to sustain a non-producing class like artisans or soldiers long-term. As a result, technology couldn't advance, and political organization couldn't scale beyond village levels. A striking example is the Tasmanians. After being cut off from mainland Australia by the Bass Strait for thousands of years, they gradually lost tools they once used, like bows and arrows. They reverted to wooden spears and crude stone axes. This wasn't because they were less intelligent but because, in their resource-poor environment, those technologies were no longer practical, and there was no one to pass on or learn from. When Europeans arrived, they brought guns, steel, and smallpox, three elements the natives had never encountered. The technological, military, and immunological gap became an unbridgeable chasm. Aboriginal Australians were driven from their ancestral lands, and New Guineans were colonized. They had intelligence, creativity, and vitality but lacked the material and organizational foundation to face the wave of conquest from outside. Yali's question is not just New Guinea's but all of humanity's: why does the divide between rich and poor, civilized and backward exist? The answer, as Diamond points out, lies not in race or intelligence but in geography, which silently shaped the historical opportunities each people received. Chapter 16: How China Became Chinese. China, with the Yellow and Yangtze River basins, is one of humanity's oldest cradles of civilization. From around 7,500 BC, people here cultivated millet and rice, domesticated pigs and chickens, and built populous, stable villages. The vast but flat terrain, with few natural barriers like high mountains, deserts, or jungles, allowed agriculture to spread quickly. An abundant river system, like the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, served as the arteries of trade, connecting regions and supporting cultural and political development. Unlike Europe, fragmented by mountains, seas, and peninsulas, China was a continuous landmass, conducive to forming and maintaining a unified centralized state. Chinese writing emerged early, used not only for recording classics and laws but also as a tool for political and cultural unity. The administrative systems of dynasties like the Qin, Han, and Tang created an efficient governance model, controlling vast territories with diverse ethnic groups. Major inventions like paper, gunpowder, the compass, and printing emerged in China centuries before Europe. Thanks to convenient water transport, these innovations spread quickly across the nation. However, there were times when China missed opportunities to advance. In the 15th century, Zhenghe's massive naval fleets reached the Indian Ocean and East Africa, but they were halted due to the Ming dynasty's inward-looking and conservative policies. This closure to the world cost China its pioneering role in maritime exploration for centuries. This chapter shows that geography played a crucial role in creating a unified, enduring China. However, geography is only the foundation. Human choices, from policies to social organization, determine whether a civilization can leverage its natural advantages for long-term development. Chapter 17: Speedboat to Polynesia. Follow the Austronesians, master navigators, who left Taiwan 3,500 years ago, crossing thousands of miles of ocean to conquer the Pacific. With double-hulled canoes, rudimentary compasses, and traditional farming knowledge, they settled countless islands from Indonesia and the Philippines to Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. Their baggage included not just navigational skills but also taro, breadfruit, pigs, and chickens, foundations for new lives. In Hawaii, fertile volcanic soil and abundant water enabled a hierarchical kingdom with powerful chiefs and a tightly organized society. Meanwhile, the resource-poor Marquesas Islands, with sparse populations, maintained only simple, egalitarian tribes. The Maori in New Zealand built hilltop fortresses for defense and developed sweet potato farming. The Rapanui on Easter Island erected massive moai statues but fell into decline due to deforestation and resource depletion. Islands like Tonga and Samoa developed tightly hierarchical societies, thanks to their ability to store food and control resources. On tiny Tikopia, with high population density, people developed strict population control rules and sustainable resource use, even accepting forms of birth restriction to ensure long-term survival. Conversely, some islands were too small or barren to sustain long-term settlement, forcing Austronesians to move on. The key point is, all these societies shared the same ancestors and skills, but the environment dictated their developmental paths. Larger islands capable of producing food surpluses fostered social stratification and centralized power. Smaller, resource-scarce, and vulnerable islands maintained equality and lived more frugally. Climate, size, soil, and geographic position were the deciding factors. This chapter is a perfect testament to Jared Diamond's argument: development is not driven by innate intelligence. Nor is it driven by genetics, but by physical and ecological conditions. From crude wooden canoes to coastal kingdoms, Polynesia is a vivid microcosm of how geography and environment shape societal destinies. Chapter 18: Hemispheres Colliding. When Europeans set foot in the Americas in 1492, two worlds, separated for tens of thousands of years, collided. Eurasia, where agriculture began 8,500 BC, had a favorable east-west axis and domesticated animals like cattle and horses. This led to continuous accumulation of technology, from guns, steel, and writing to immunity against deadly diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Meanwhile, the Americas, with a long north-south axis hindering the spread of crops and animals, had only llamas and turkeys. They built great empires like the Inca and Aztec but hadn't reached steel, guns, or disease resistance. When Cortés reached Mexico and Pizarro Peru, it wasn't just Spanish armies versus native forces but millennia of developmental disparity clashing. Smallpox preceded the conqueror's footsteps. Up to 95% of Aztecs died after exposure to the disease, and the Incas were ravaged by epidemics before Pizarro even arrived. Writing allowed Spaniards to plan wars based on prior conquest records. For example, Pizarro learned from Cortés to defeat the Inca Empire with cunning and superior weapons. Europeans weren't smarter but benefited from a series of accumulated geographic and ecological advantages. They built ocean-crossing ships, had draft animals, dense cities, and vast trade networks. In contrast, the Incas had only stone spears and quipu cords for record-keeping. Without writing, horses, or steel, they were at a disadvantage against the invading wave. This chapter is a powerful summation of the entire book. Geography, not intelligence or morality, decided who would be the conqueror and who the victim in the clash of hemispheres. From Sumer's wheat fields to the blood-soaked battlefields of Tenochtitlan, humans didn't just make history, they were guided by geography at every step. Chapter 19, How Africa Became Black Africa, a continent of profound diversity, holds over 1,000 languages and countless rich cultures. Yet, geography posed a major barrier to unified development. The Sahara Desert stretches across, separating North Africa from the rest of the continent, while the Congo rainforest divides southern regions. Malaria, especially deadly in sub-Saharan Africa, limited populations and hindered animal domestication. Horses and cattle succumbed to tsetse flies. In West Africa, people cultivated millet and sorghum and smelted iron from around 3000 BC, forming societies like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. However, the absence of draft animals made large-scale agriculture difficult. The Bantu, from Nigeria, migrated south, bringing metallurgy, farming, and languages, shaping much of sub-Saharan Africa. They built kingdoms like Great Zimbabwe and developed regional trade, though still slower than Eurasia. Mali had abundant gold and hosted academic centers like Timbuktu, but lacked warships, gunpowder, or maritime technology like Spain. When European empires arrived, their weapons and germs overwhelmed local achievements. Though malaria killed many Europeans, it wasn't enough to halt their advance. Jungles, rapids, and shallow coasts limited internal trade, slowing integration and industrialization. Africa is a resilient continent, with remarkable civilizations like Aksum, Nubia, Mali, and Zimbabwe. Yet, harsh climates, scarce domesticable crops and animals, and dangerous tropical diseases slowed accumulation and technological growth. From sorghum fields in the Sahel to forgotten archaeological sites, this chapter recounts the tenacious journey of a continent rising against adversity, forging its unique, challenging, yet admirable path. Africa's history is not just a tale of setbacks but a symbol of inner strength, creativity in harsh conditions, adaptability to fierce nature, and the effort to preserve identity amid waves of invasion. It's proof that, despite environmental disadvantages, humans can achieve remarkable feats in their own way. Epilogue: The View from Eden. If you ask why some peoples dominated the world while others did not, the answer, according to Jared Diamond, lies not in intelligence, morality, or innate qualities, but in the history of geography. The entire book is a journey exploring how climate, geographic axes, plants, animals, diseases, and technology interacted to create profound differences among societies. From the Fertile Crescent to China, from Western Europe to indigenous Americas, from New Guinea to Africa, each region had unique physical conditions shaping its ability to develop agriculture, social organization, technology, and disease resistance. Places with abundant domesticable crops and animals, mild climates, and few geographic barriers quickly accumulated surpluses, formed classes. They advanced to statehood earlier. These factors, not inherent talent, gave Europeans the edge in guns, germs, and steel when clashing with the rest of the world. The Incas weren't lacking in intelligence but lacked horses, iron, and disease immunity. Aboriginal Australians weren't less creative but lived in an environment that didn't allow storage or expansive trade networks. Each continent followed its own historical path, and that path was largely drawn by terrain, climate, and nature. Looking from Eden, where humanity began, Diamond urges us to abandon outdated prejudices about race or superiority. Instead, we should understand history as a series of interactions between humans and their environment, a long game with rules we didn't choose. This understanding will help humanity move forward with tolerance, science, and humility.